Hello and welcome to episode 21 of Reflecting the Way Radio, Deception, Marriage Supper of the Lamb, or Feast of the Goat. At the top of the show here, I'll just remind you to make sure and check out our social media accounts. We can be found on Twitter at Reflect the Way. We're Reflecting the Way on Facebook. And don't forget to check us out at reflectingtheway.com. If you haven't signed up for our email list, I would strongly encourage you to do that from our homepage. And this episode is a companion episode to the concluding entry in our ongoing series on Saturnian occultism. So if you've been following along, you know this is a long time coming. If this is the first you're hearing of it, I would strongly encourage you to go back and reread or read for the first time or listen to the previous entries in this series, as this is kind of a culmination, and I'm sure if you're jumping in here, you're probably going to be a little bit lost. So right up front here, I will freely admit that the content of this show and the article associated that's linked in the description box below is of a highly speculative nature. I'm not saying this is bona fide fact. I'm not even necessarily going to say that I quote-unquote believe the theory I'm putting forward, but it is certainly a thought exercise worth going through. Now, what am I alluding to? Well, in this series, we have gone all the way from a pre-Adamic world through the pre-flood into the Old Testament, through the New Testament, and we've kind of arrived here now today. And what's left? Well, what's left is the end times. And as should be no shock to anybody listening that's been following along, the Dark Lord of Time and Death himself certainly has a role to play at the end of time. And this isn't going to so much be about unpacking what that looks like, so much as it is a hypothetical situation. Now, if you've grown up in church or around church, or if you've spent any amount of time in the traditional mainstream church, keyword there being traditional, lots of the new wave sort of churches, if you can call them that, really won't touch this subject much. But if you've grown up in a more traditional setting or you've spent any amount of time there, chances are fairly good that you've at least heard a message on the end times, and specifically the rapture. And if you don't know what I'm referring to when I say rapture, that is the teaching that Jesus will, at some point in the future, return to earth to collect the faithful dead and alive and bring them to what's known colloquially as the marriage supper of the Lamb. Now, there's a great deal of debate within Christendom about the nature and timing of the rapture, and that's not what this is. There is a great deal of debate, especially about the timing, whether the rapture happens before the tribulation or the end times, right? The Antichrist coming onto the scene and all of the judgments of Revelation being poured out, or if it happens halfway through, or if it happens after the tribulation, or what exactly it looks like. But again, this isn't going to be the topic for today. What I want to focus on here is a potential, I'm not saying this will happen, but a potential deception. And I think that Protestant Christians will be particularly vulnerable to this. And let's back up just half a step here and start with a question. As I'm sure many of you listening know, in the world of the occult, the dark arts, the arcane, there is a special significance put on blood and bloodshed. Right? There's even echoes of this in Christianity, the powers in the blood. And to manifest certain entities, Hollywood even gets this right in a lot of cases, practitioners of the dark arts will sacrifice humans or animals, shed the blood, and use that energy to bring forth an entity. The type of entity and what they're trying to accomplish varies, but in a lot of cases, there is ritualistic bloodshed. Now, like I said, this concept is present in Christianity, if you really think about it. Christians will often, I don't want to use the word invoke, but it kind of fits, invoke the power of the blood of Jesus, or claim authority under the power of the shed blood of Jesus Christ. And while it is different, it's the same concept, where the blood holds power. Just like that old hymn, there is power, 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 wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. Now, some of these mechanisms are universal truths, and some of them are twisted. So the dark side uses shed blood to manifest fallen entities many times. But this leads to a question, and that question is this. If the Antichrist, not necessarily the spirit of Antichrist, but the embodied Antichrist that is so often referenced by prophecy teachers, I use the term loosely, the Antichrist, the son of perdition, right? The arch bad guy in the cosmic story of existence. If he is the be-all and end-all of evil manifest on earth in the last days, let me ask you this. Would you not consider it possible that that entity would require a blood sacrifice to manifest? Just going to let that soak in for a minute. If the Antichrist proper is the most evil manifest entity in the last days, is it not a possibility that he or it will require a blood sacrifice to manifest on earth? I say yes, it is a possibility. Now, we can get into all kinds of stuff here with whether the Antichrist is a resurrected historical figure, which is a possibility, or if he or it is born of a union between the fallen and an earthly woman or whatever. But it's not important. What's important is the invocation and manifestation of this Antichrist entity, being that it is one of the most significant and powerful occult entities or arcane entities to manifest on the face of the earth physically. It, to me, is no stretch to say that he or it will require shed blood to manifest. And it's an even smaller step to assume from that point that he or it, the Antichrist proper, will require one of the largest blood sacrifices ever undertaken on the face of the earth. Now, this rolls into another question. Remember, I said this was highly speculative. You can take this for what you think it's worth. But this raises the question, where does the blood come from? And I don't want to get too deep into teaching occult stuff here, so I won't. But, sacrificing a dog ain't going to cut it. It will be human sacrifice that will be required. And there's all kinds of different stuff tied up in that I don't even want to give it the time of day to talk about, but it will be human sacrifice, assuming this scenario plays out. So where do all the humans come from for this sacrifice? Well, consider this, if you will. In Christianity, and this doesn't apply exclusively to Christianity by any means, but in Christianity, there is a widely held belief that the rapture I mentioned earlier happens before the Antichrist manifests on earth. Now, whether you believe that's true or not, frankly, doesn't matter for the purposes of this argument. But let me ask you this. If the adversary is the great imitator, why would it be out of the realm of possibility for the adversary to fake a rapture? Rather than having, if you recall from sections past, rather than having the true light of the Father carried by Jesus, seeing that come in the sky while Jesus reaps the earth for the faithful dead and the faithful living and brings them to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Rather than that, what happens if a bunch of Christians who are looking for a pre-tribulation rapture, regardless of your belief on that theology, looking for that, look up in the sky and see a light entity that is masquerading as Jesus, and they're expecting this rapture. But that entity, rather than being an entity of, the light of the Father, it is that anti-light of death that is hard to tell the difference between that and the real deal at face value, right? You need spiritual discernment. What happens when you have all these Christians disarmed by seeing what they think they've been waiting for their whole life and for the last 2,000 years? They see that and they look up and they say, gasp, take me with you, assuming they're looking at their Savior, when in actual fact, they are staring down Lucifer, masquerading as the angel of the true light. It's an angel of light. It's just a matter of what kind we're talking about here. Now, in so doing, when you look up and say, take me, you have now given that entity legal grounds, cosmically speaking, to take you. And rather than usher you into the marriage supper of the Lamb as the bride of Christ and an honored guest, you will be ushered into the feast of the goat, as I've dubbed it. And rather than being an honored guest, you're on the menu. Okay? You've given your consent to be taken when you looked up and were deceived and said, take me with you. You're on the menu, and your bloodshed will be harnessed and used to manifest the Antichrist. That may sound far-fetched, but I would implore you to think about that. Now, this is a broad topic, and frankly, I'm giving you a very 101 kind of rundown on my thoughts here, but this doesn't only apply to Christians, not by any means, because we talked about how Saturn, the entity and or the planet and or the entities it represents, projects reality. To what degree? Who knows? But there's an element of projection of reality. Now, remember, every time that I can think of in the New Testament where Jesus talks about the end times, the first thing he always says is, be not deceived. Believe no man, right? If it were possible, even the very elect themselves could be deceived, okay? Now, bear that in mind, because if Saturn, in whatever form you want to understand this, is projecting reality, whether it be strictly spiritual or through some technological means, it's not inconceivable to think that he could show the average church-going, Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Pentecostal, whatever, the average Protestant Christian, this image of a Jesus-esque image in the clouds, getting their consent that way, saying, take me. And you can extend that beyond Christianity, because if this is a projection, and specifically a projection into the mind, not into the atmosphere physically, if it's into the mind and you only think you see it, right? Or you actually do see it, but it's coming from an outside source directly to your mind, this can then be extrapolated from simply Christians being preyed on here to New Agers, atheists, the ancient astronaut folks. They can look up and see a scene from Independence Day, and the little gray men will say, we're here to help, just come with us. And they'll say, take me. And they'll be ushered into the Feast of the Goat, and they'll be on the menu just same as you. Or you could go to the Middle East, and you could have an image of, Muhammad or Allah or anything to that effect, and Muslims, no doubt, or show them their Mahdi, their coming Mahdi, they will say, yes, take me with you. And the consent is the same. The cosmic rules of engagement don't change based on religion, frankly. Or you can take it to the Far East. Come as an image of the Buddha or an avatar of Vishnu, And those religions will undoubtedly, maybe not all of them, but some percentage of the population that adheres to that will consent to being taken. Now, what better way to harvest, I know it's kind of a cold term, but that's what it is, harvest the souls and the blood required to manifest the Antichrist on earth than this kind of mass deception? I would put forward, not much. You can't do much better, because you are having the people as the sacrifice complicit in their own murder. And if you followed the site for any amount of time, you know we've talked about lesser magic, telling the people what you're doing before you do it, and adding more fuel to your magical fire, right? Same idea here. So it's definitely something to consider. I'm not saying I think this will happen. I have no idea. But it's certainly something that has crossed my mind through the last couple years of researching this topic. Because the adversary copycats everything else and inserts himself everywhere else that he can. Why not here? And why not for such a nefarious purpose? So to echo the words of Jesus, be not deceived. You constantly have to have your guard up. Even if this doesn't come to pass the way I've said it could, not would, but could, it could be something else. Not completely dissimilar, just looks a lot different. Keep your head on your shoulders. And with that, being that this is the concluding entry in our long-running and ongoing series on Saturn, I want to leave you with a couple of closing thoughts. Not just for the episode, but for the series at large. And the couple things I want to leave you with here. Number one is balance. I know we've dealt with some deep, dark, nasty, ugly, disgusting topics in this series, and to a degree that is necessary to expose the works of darkness, as we're told to do. However, it is important that an interest and understanding in this topic doesn't become an obsession to the exclusion of the light side. Now, of course, this is a two-edged blade that cuts both ways, because it is my firm belief that your understanding of the glory and goodness of God will only extend to a height that is comparable to your depth of understanding of the dark, evil, hateful nature of the enemy. That's up for debate, but it's a pretty good rule to follow. So I would encourage you to seek a balance here, where we've dealt with dark, ugly, nasty things, but it's important to keep in balance the light side over the dark, frankly, but not at the expense of throwing out the dark side because it's uncomfortable to look at. You still have to understand your enemy, and you still have to expose that working of darkness. There is a time and place for sweet Jesus-isms and pretty music. Absolutely there is. But there's also a time to do the deep, dark, dirty work that we've been covering here. So what does balance look like for you? I can't tell you that. That's an issue of discernment. That's something you have to figure out for yourself. And kind of going hand in hand with this, something else I want to touch on is, if you followed this series, realize while this information, I believe, is highly important and extremely relevant to spiritual development, the average person on the street, saved or unsaved, Christian or not, spiritual or not, religious or not, doesn't matter. People in church, people out of church, doesn't matter. 99% of them have no idea what this has to do with anything and don't care to find out. Does that matter? Yes, it does. Are they responsible to know this and other things like it? Maybe not specifically this, but they are required to expose the manifest works of darkness and understand their enemy. Absolutely they are. But here's the thing. I've never met anybody that wakes up one day with a complete understanding of the way the world works and all the deception and lies they've been exposed to for their entire life, I can look back at different points in my relatively short life and see kind of tableaus or snapshots of points in time where I had realizations that moved my understanding of the way the world works up a level, and up a level, and up another level, and up another level. And if I look back far enough, there is a time when, and this will apply to everybody listening, there is a time when you look back, you can see where you were completely and utterly asleep, blissfully ignorant. Some of us wish we could go back some days, briefly, but at the end of the day, you're better off in this position. I say that to say this. When you look at somebody on the street or in a church that is, and I don't want to sound rude here, but doe-eyed, barely awake, self-centered, self-absorbed, completely oblivious to anything like this, anything left of mainstream, it is really easy to look at them down your nose and say, what an ignorant sheep. They'll never know better. And you know what? With an attitude like that, no, they won't. So when you see people like that, understand it is your responsibility not to look down at them, not to dissociate yourself from them, not to get a superiority complex or a certain arrogance about you. It is your job to educate those people with discernment. And there's the key, because walking up to them and unloading both barrels will get you absolutely nowhere, and they're going to pass you a roll of tinfoil. Okay? Some of us have bought stock in tinfoil, but that's a different discussion. Understand that you were there at one point, and if you unloaded everything you know on somebody, or if somebody had done that to you when you were in that position, nothing would have sank in. You would have gone full-blown cognitive dissonance and thrown out everything they just said. So understand, it is your job, if you know something someone else doesn't, in humility and through discernment, to educate them. Some people will be slower than others. Some people are going to laugh at you. It will happen. It does happen all the time. But frankly, it's only partially that person's fault because they've been programmed to do that. That's where patience and humility and being a servant comes in. And you do not win these people, even if they're a Christian. I don't want to sound like we're talking about conversion here, but you don't win them over or open their eyes or wake them up to what is going on around them by hiding in a hole, sticking your head in the sand, petting your new knowledge in a corner like Smeagol. You take my Lord of the Rings reference here and going, precious, right? To hide in your hole with a persecution complex is to do the kingdom no good. Satan has you right where he wants you if that's what you're doing. If you're not getting out there, outside of your comfort zone, outside of those people you usually talk to about such things, and exposing others to this, you're doing no good. And effectively what you're doing is, rather than growing spiritually by intaking this information and processing it and growing fruit from it, what you're doing is you're walking up to a buffet of knowledge, loading your plate, eating, going back for seconds, polishing that off, maybe thirds and fourths, then you get dessert, and all you do is sit at the table, you don't share with anybody, and meanwhile, there's 25 homeless people outside the window of the restaurant watching you eat while they're starving, and you're just hungrily scarfing your food down, giving nothing to anybody else. And that, friends, is nothing short of sin. And it is a sin of the worst kind, because you are taking something God has given you and you are wasting it. You are consuming it, and you are becoming nothing but a spiritual pig. You're nothing but a spiritual pig when you do that. If you don't have output after input, you're doing something wrong. And it's like I said, we can't stay in our hole and hope nobody comes and persecutes us because we think everybody's out to get us. If everybody's out to get us, we're doing something right. If you only think everybody's out to get you, you're not really doing anything, okay? If you haven't experienced persecution, you're not doing anything. Maybe you are, but you're doing it wrong. And that may sound harsh, but that's what I'm hearing in my spirit here as I'm speaking. So it's coming out, and I don't know, hopefully I'm not putting too many people off by saying that unnecessarily, but it is what it is. I speak as I'm led, and that's how I've been led here for the last couple of minutes. So with that, I'll say be sure and check out the article linked in the description box below. There's a few more final thoughts there I didn't cover here because I got taken in a different direction, but so be it. That's fine. Check that out, and there's a little bit more detail on the whole Rapture scenario. Also, don't forget to check us out at Reflect the Way on Twitter, Reflecting the Way on Facebook, and www.reflectingtheway.com. Sign up for our email list. Be the first to get all the latest and greatest content. And just as a little sidebar and announcement here, we may go on a very brief hiatus for a week or two or maybe 3. We'll see. Just coming off this rather large undertaking of a series. It's taken quite a bit of effort. So hopefully you folks got something out of it. Hopefully you learned something. And with that in mind, if you found it useful, please share it. Please share it with your friends, family, and social circles. And if you have found it useful and you would like to support us financially, not saying you need to by any stretch, but if you feel led to do so, on the website we do have a donate button on the sidebar and in the footer, and that can be done through PayPal. So with that, I will leave you, and blessings.